If you had $1 million in illegal drug money today that you wanted to get out of this country or wanted to launder into clean funds in this country, how would you do it?
I put it in a suitcase, get on a plane, and leave.
Yeah. What now? You say you'd get into a plane and you'd leave.
I take a flight to Panama.
When you got to the other
Caymans.
end, what would happen?
Excuse me?
When you got to the other end, when your plane landed, when you got off the plane, now you got a suitcase. What happens at the other end?
Depends upon where on the other end. In Panama, there's no problem. You know, a few $100s to a customs or an immigration official, and I just walked right through with the suitcase. Mm-hmm. At one time, it was the same in the Caymans, same in the Bahamas. And no problem on the other end whatsoever because the money is going into one of their banks.
Well, is this still going on today?
I believe most definitely it is, sir.
All right. Well, my time has expired, and I appreciate your answers. Let's see. Mr. Hubbard, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the witness being with us today and candidly answering our questions.
You've been watching live coverage of a House Banking Subcommittee hearing on drug money laundering. The hooded witness, whose voice has been altered. We'll be hearing more in a little while.
Let me quickly explain that I oppose legalizing drugs in this country, and 99% of my constituents do, but there are some who argue that this would be maybe a solution to it. But would you describe the technique known as smurfing and tell us how much money you laundered in this fashion?
I don't understand that term.
How about cashier's checks?
Well, cashier's check, many occasions we were asked to ship checks back on somebody to hand carry them down. What I would basically do was get a bunch of people that I knew, who basically knew what I was involved with, but not detail-wise, and for every check that they would get for me, $9,000, $9,500, anything under the $10,000 limit, I would give them $100. And we'd have people that would come in with 3, 4 checks a day. We would supply the money, they would get the checks. And these checks could just be mailed down with no problem, or hand carried down, or deposited into accounts in this country.
Did you have any trouble recruiting these people?
None whatsoever.
How does the Medellin Cartel interface with other drug dealers in the rest of the world, such as India and Asia? Is there much competition among other countries, or does Colombia have quite a lock on this situation?
Colombia basically has a lock on cocaine.
Why?
Basically because of where the coca plant is grown. We're talking about Peru, Bolivia, and some in cocaine itself. Although some talk of experimenting in growing the coca plant in Jamaica and in the Dominican Republic have taken place, where it's gone from there, I don't know. But Colombia is basically the place for the processing, and with its surrounding countries doing the growing. As far as competition with the Golden Triangle, if you will, in 1983, I believe it was, Pablo Escobar brought down some people from the Golden Triangle and put in a poppy crop in Colombia, and to my knowledge has been quite successful in growing poppy and producing heroin in Colombia at the present time.
In countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia and some others we can think of, they don't have quite the crime problem we do in the United States or Colombia. In fact, if you're caught stealing over in Saudi Arabia or Iran, many times your hand is cut off as a punishment. If you're caught doing something more serious, you're immediately executed. Many of my constituents repeatedly call for tougher punishment on our criminals, especially drug dealers. Do you have the death penalty in Colombia for drug dealers?
You don't have the death penalty in Colombia for anything. It's non-existent.
What is the punishment for a drug dealer?
You've been watching live coverage of a House Banking Subcommittee hearing on drug money laundering. We'll rejoin the hearing in a little while.
I've heard people have walked.
We now go back to Capitol Hill, where a House Banking Subcommittee is hearing testimony about drug money laundering. The witness admittedly laundered about $300 million for the Medellin cocaine cartel. He's being questioned at the moment by Representative Norman Shumway, Republican of California.
During the years that you were involved in this operation, because of the efforts of the government, laws that we passed here in Congress, for example, did you notice it becoming any more difficult to import drugs into this country?
No, not at all.
Was there ever any impact of laws that we passed making it more risky or more difficult to do any part of your operation?
A little bit more risky on this end. The profit margin was cut a little bit, but it's still coming in and coming in faster than ever.
What about recruiting of pilots? Was that ever difficult?
Never, especially, point an example, right now. There are a lot of Eastern Airline pilots on the street.
Are the airplanes yours, or are they furnished by the pilots, or how do you get the...
It's done both ways.
Both ways.
It's done both ways. We had 9 of our own aircraft. Pilots would have their own aircraft. Aircraft can be rented just for the purpose.
How did you get a pilot? What would you do to enlist someone to fly a plane?
Generally through a recommendation that one of the other pilots knew. It was a group that had been established over the years. Their integrity was impeccable. Their recommendation alone was enough for us.
But you had no difficulty really finding enough people to fly those airplanes?
None whatsoever.
You mentioned knowing the frequencies that are used by our DEA and I guess Coast Guard. And I know also that they use radar and have other systems in place. Were you aware of the scope of their radar, and how did you get around it? That's more than just their radio frequencies.
You're correct in that, but by radar, the most effective you have is the balloons that are being used, and basically they're not being used. They're on the ground more often than they're in the air. And again, across the radios, you know where they are, you know where the radars are operating by the communication between base to the aircraft.
Why are the balloons on the ground?
I can't answer that question.
Just not an operation, huh? Going back to Cuba for a moment, were you aware of a flight that had to land in Cuba?
One of our pilots was forced into Cuba, not by Cuban military. He was just forced to land there. And it was the southern half of the island. He was told by the colonel in charge of the base he landed at that no problem this time, but if he wanted to land again, it would cost him $10,000 for every flight coming in. We never utilized it, though.
I see. Now, the few arrests that have been made in Colombia and the extraditions that have been ordered by some of those justices in Colombia, those really have not invaded the Medellin Cartel itself very much. Is that cartel still operating at full function, or have we hampered their style at all? What's the status of it at present?
I believe they're still operating at full tilt, which is obvious by the busts that have gone down recently, the quantities that have been taken down. Those quantities do have to hurt, but you know, they have their business expenses and they will continue to do business until they're stopped.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We've been watching. Subcommittee is hearing testimony about drug money laundering. The witness admittedly laundered about $300 million for the Medellin cocaine cartel. He's being asked at the moment about the setting up of shell corporations. Let's listen in.
Fill us in on that. How does the FBI have the best money laundering operation?
They'll set up a sting to identify, an undercover operation to identify individuals in the cartel. They will facilitate money laundering through the government.
And you mean the cartel is brazen enough or smart enough?
No, not brazen enough. They don't know it's a sting when it's going on, but they're going to lose a few people. But again, they're losing messenger boys, street-level people. It doesn't hurt.
Oh, I see.
And the gain is worth more than the loss.
What is your evaluation of the law enforcement? Do you think that they would be better placed trying to identify shell corporations and then tipping off financial institutions to look out for large transactions involving those shell corporations?
Again, I don't think it'll do any good. I think the only thing that's going to do any good is to go after the crop or the chemicals used to produce the cocaine. I don't think anything beyond that will do any good.
I understand that you were incarcerated in, June the 5th of 1985?
That's correct.
And you're not incarcerated now?
No.
What is your evaluation? Do you think that we are improving in our interdiction of drugs, or is it about the same or worse?
In some instances worse, and I'll give you a point. basically in money laundering. One of the finest operations ever established to go after money laundering was Operation Greenbacks in Miami. That operation has just been disbanded. Again, with no logic to it. As far as interdiction, we're following the basic procedures we followed for the last 10 years. We're following the basic procedures that I found it so easy to beat. Nobody has made the changes that have to be made in order to beat the problem.
What is your thinking of why has so much and why is it that so much large quantities of drugs have been discovered in the last few months?
Personal opinion would be the only thing I can give in this, but basically because what is going on in Colombia, they're trying to get their large stores out of Colombia into some place that they would consider safe.
And so they're risking these large quantities in order to get them out of Colombia.
It appears that way to me.
The House Banking Subcommittee hearing into drug...
Man who knows something of which he speaks. His identity is being concealed by his voice being altered and the hood that you see placed on his head. Let's listen.
You weren't involved in any of that personally?
No, sir.
Okay. You have suggested basically in your testimony, Mr. Witness, that the way to address this problem is eradication and stop the processing. You believe that to be true?
I believe that to be true, yes, sir.
You make mention of the fact 95% or so of the military and of the higher levels of society, those responsible persons in Colombia would support that.
I believe they would, yes,
How does assuming that's true, how does the United States bring that about? How do we get those people to agree to let us go down there and use our equipment, fly across their country and eradicate it?
Give them the economic support that they will need to reestablish a legitimate crop and reestablish legitimate businesses so that they can replace the coca crop and the coca business.
Well, you know, in Bolivia, there's a valley 70 miles wide and 250 miles long. Is it Peru? Anyway, there's one very large valley down there. That's from here to New York, 70 miles wide. Can we eradicate all of that? I mean, is that practical in your opinion?
I think it's more practical than what we're doing now. How much are we spending on law enforcement and interdiction and getting absolutely nowhere?
Well, were you involved when, pardon me, when we started to try to use the military in an increased way? Did that...
I don't think we should try and use our military down there. I think we ought to give the
should not use the military?
Not our military. I think we ought to initially give the Colombian government the support that they need to use their military. Then, if they can't solve it, we should.
Well, there are people around here. You know, we've got AWACS machines. We've got the capacity to shoot down airplanes that we can identify. And I'm not talking about the dentist that's coming back from the Bahamas with his family in a backseat of a Piper Cub. We know in order to enter the air defense identification zone, we know where every airplane is. Should we shoot them down? Would that help?
I think it would put the fear of God into some of the pilots that are doing it. But as far as shooting them down, the one flight that we did lose in the 5 years we were operating was by breaking Air Defense Command. We were too high and too fast. They never even fired a shot at us. It took them 2.5 hours to get us onto the ground also.
Say that to me again. The one airplane you lost?
We lost one flight, one shipment. It was December 13th, 1981 over Tampa. We were trying a new plane, which was a Conquest. We were coming in too high and too fast, and we alerted Air Defense Command, who in turn scrambled a pair of Phantoms out of Panama City, Florida. And it took 2.5 hours for them to force the plane down, during which time the co-pilot was jettisoning a load over the Gulf of Mexico. And when the plane finally was forced down, it was empty.
That's why it's better to have smaller, slower airplanes, right?
We learned that, and we also learned a very other important lesson. That was the flight that taught the cartel that coke floats. Because it was the next day they found those duffel bags floating in the Gulf of Mexico, and that started the water drops.
Yeah. Well, do you think we ought to sink the boats too?
No, I think we just ought to eradicate the crop, and then we can eliminate all this other nonsense.
I thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Kanjorski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Just something on yourself, Mr. Witness. Are you a graduate engineer, did you say?
No, I'm short some credits for graduation.
I have to make an observation. Tell me whether I'm correct. Do you have any feelings of hesitancy of what you participated in when you were running aliens in the country and drugs in the country, or do you have no feelings on that matter?
When I was doing it, I have to say I had no feelings about it, because to me it was, at that time, an innocent vice. I basically realized what was happening and what damage it was doing when I was incarcerated, and I saw the damage that it does do.
Your act of contrition occurred after imprisonment, is that it?
Correct.
That's a nice way of having it happen. You've been incarcerated since 1985. The statute of limitations has almost expired on everybody you dealt with. How many people have you been successful in aiding and having prosecuted in this country as a result of their activities?
Several groups have gone down.
How many people have been tried and found guilty and incarcerated?
Because of me?
Yes.
30 to 40 at the present time.
All right. And these are people you dealt with at that time. You dealt with them as a friend or a partner or a dealer, but then as a result of making the deal with the government, you turned evidence against them. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, you come up with this solution, but before I get to that, you talked in some of your statements that you dealt with bankers.
I said that the money launderers dealt with the bankers.
Well, didn't you indicate that you knew some bankers that you could take $250,000 to, and they knew how to take you into a vault, count the money, and then deposit it in banks?
In one instance, the Bank of America, I took $3 million in, and they took me into the vault and counted the money.
And Bank of America where?
In Miami, on Flagler.
And you dealt with whom? The head cashier?
The head cashier.
And has that cashier been identified subsequently to the Justice
I don't even
Department?
remember her name. This is a transaction that took place in 1981, I believe it was.
Do you know whether or not that cashier was ever prosecuted?
I have no idea.
Do you know whether that cashier is still operating?
She very well possibly could be. Again, I have no way of knowing.
Are you working on a regular basis with the FBI or someone else in the justice enforcement area of this country to tell them about these things and check whether or not they're doing anything about it?
As strange as it seems, I've tried and have set up several operations to try and help the government. After setting up the last operation, my parole officer tried to violate me for setting up the operation and trying to help the government take down these people, because I had to make a phone call to a former associate.
He felt
so I'm being stopped from helping.
I see. Did he have the impression you may be getting back into the business?
He knew very well that I'm not getting back into the business. Sir, my phone bill and calls to the government alone runs between $300 and $400 a month, just trying to follow up the cases and see what can be done.
Are you being supported presently by the government?
Unfortunately, I am.
I noticed you surrendered about $1.2 million in assets. What other assets have you been allowed to retain after your arrest because of your favorable turning of state's evidence?
My family and my personal clothing.
That's it?
That's it.
That's all you have. Okay, now just one other question I have here that's interesting. You come up with this solution that sounds rather reasonable. In light of the fact that you estimate that the profits on the $100 billion a year brought in this country amount to about 3%, that's $3 billion. So I suspect you're saying that that's all the profit the cartel gets out of this whole operation. It may be very cheap just to directly send them a check for $3 billion and they'd give up the $97 billion worth of cocaine importation. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, but what I'm saying, the 3% that the cartel makes, I'm referring to the Ochoas, Escobar, Gotcha, Ado Mejia, and the other people that sit at the top.
That's the net of their operation.
That's the net of their operation. But from there...
They're pretty close to General Motors in profits there, aren't they, about 3%?
I think they operate more efficiently.
Just a little more efficiently. The question on eradication... If we were to spend, subsidize the farmers of Colombia and Peru, and they agreed to eradication, and that cost us a billion or several $1 billion, why do you feel there wouldn't be another area of the world that would meet the need for drugs in this country? Why wouldn't Pakistan, Afghanistan, or the Middle East, or someone come up with a method of production and smuggling in this country of drugs?
They probably will. It's something that has got to be reestablished, and our values have got to be reestablished. A comprehensive education program has to be established in order to train the youth, kindergarten on up,
Okay, that sort of answers the question. And you do recognize that we have a large portion of our population that are absolutely addicted. And
we continue to follow the testimony of the secret witness who describes in detail, vivid detail, about laundering huge sums of drug money. We will return to our coverage on Capitol Hill right after this. He wears a hood and his voice has been altered, but he continues to provide in vivid detail the story of the drug cartels in Colombia. Let's return now to more of this testimony on Capitol Hill.
There are some changes necessary to break the cycle, as I recall your term. And I'm not sure if you're referring to laundering, if you're referring to the drug problem generally. What did you have in mind when you said that, if you recall?
The drug problem generally. Once you kill the crop, everything else dies. It's like cutting off the head of the snake. The snake dies. That will give us enough time to regroup and reevaluate and start the education program that's necessary in order to train the youth of the United States so that that problem won't re-entrench itself.
Presently, if you have knowledge of this area, what part of the cocaine processed in Colombia do you think is grown in Colombia versus Bolivia and Peru, for example?
Colombia grew about 20%, and the quality is not nearly as good as Bolivia and Peru.
Now, if we were able to make a major breakthrough and destroy the processing and reshipment operations in Colombia, your estimate, would it simply move to other parts of the hemisphere or elsewhere?
It would take 2 to 3 years to reestablish a usable crop of coca. And with that amount of time, we could do what has to be done to ensure that it's not done.
Do we have parts of our government's resources, such as the military, for interdiction and detection, the intelligence gathering capacity, that would put the fear of God into the people now operating out of Colombia, or in effect be more effective in dealing with it? Can you see parts of our government we're not using well? And if so, what would be your suggestions, and what areas would you focus on?
Getting into the intelligence community, I won't even want to delve into it. As far as what we're doing in Colombia, at the present time, with what President Barco is doing in the statements that he is making or has made, I would basically follow his lead and give him the support that he's requesting and see if he can't solve the problem by himself. I think he can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Let's see, what's his name? Hoagland? Mr. Hoagland, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a staff memo here, Mr. Witness, which summarizes your views and has been very helpful, I think, in our understanding your testimony. And the first point that you made was that in your opinion, we could have a lot of luck through eradication by, as you indicated, cutting off the head of the snake. And I think Congressman Beerider and Konchorski and others have discussed that. Your next suggestion is that the second most vulnerable part of the cocaine trade are the large amounts of chemicals that are used in the processing of cocaine, in converting the cocoa leaves to cocaine. Would you discuss your feelings about that, where the chemicals come from, what we might be able to do to cut off the supply of chemicals?
One of the biggest supplies of chemicals that was being used was coming from the United States. However, laws have been passed restricting the usage of and controlling the sale and distribution of the necessary chemicals. This country is basically sealed off as far as chemicals into the cocaine laboratories. The problem now would be seeking the cooperation of England and especially Germany, who is the largest producer of the chemicals, the ethers, the acetones that are used in and the hydrochloric acid that is used in the production of the cocaine.
Now, can you tell us the names of the companies that are currently supplying those chemicals?
The favored among the chemists for the cartel always has been Merck's of Germany.
Do you know what we're doing here to try and convince the German government and that company to assist us in these efforts?
I have no idea.
But your suggestion is that if we could cut off the supply of chemicals, it would help a lot.
If you cut off the supply of chemicals, you cut off the drug.
And the processing itself takes place in Colombia, is that right?
I would venture to say that the processing labs most of them been moved from Colombia after the Tranquilandia bust. And again, I would venture an educated guess, if you will, that they've moved somewhere into the jungles of northern Brazil.
All right. Now, you also are summarized in this staff memo here as talking about the epidemic, the cocaine epidemic in Colombia, that it lasted 5 to 6 years, that a lot of people died as a result. And you project that we're probably going to have an epidemic here in the United States that may run a little bit longer, perhaps as long as 10 years, and then we'll lose a lot of our citizens in that epidemic. But
I firmly believe so, unless it's stopped, yes.
All right, and then what's going to happen after that epidemic's over?
People are going to realize exactly how ridiculous it is and how dangerous it is and just stay away from it. Basically the same thing that happened in Colombia. And before Colombia was Peru.
Money laundering and the drug operations he's testifying operate out of Colombia.
The Medellin or Medellin Cartel, and we have the Cali Cartel. How would you characterize these two in the overall drug distribution business?
As extremely efficient money-making machines.
We have been told that the Medellin, would that be the correct pronunciation?
Medellin.
Is more aggressive, more of an organization that disciplines its persons, as opposed to the Cali, which is more professional. Are those comments that you would agree with?
Basically, yes. The people from Medellin are fighters, the people from Cali are lovers.
It has been said that Mr. Noriega's reluctance, one of the reasons for his reluctance to step down or leave, is because of his close connections with the Medellin Cartel and the fact that he would be a marked man. Have people retired from that cartel and successfully lived out their lives?
None that I know of.
Is it permitted?
To my knowledge,
is retirement permitted?
Excuse me?
Is retirement permitted from the Medellin?
I tried on several occasions, and I was told the only way out is either a cemetery or a jail.
So it is one of these, well, you characterize it as silver or lead situations then, once you're a part of the organization?
Basically so, yes.
Have you found that in your dealings, and I realize that you have been out of this since, what, 1985?
That's correct.
During that period that you were very active, have you found any, to any degree, members of the U.S. Official establishment willing to accept bribes or on the take?
The people working with me and myself never really went into it on this end. We never really had a need to pay off government officials, U.S. government officials, because there was always a way around them.
Back to transportation, give me an example of what you considered to be, during your active years, the best type of plane, its cruising speed, and the best location in the United States for purposes of landing.
The planes that we were most effective with were Navajo Panthers. Twin Lycoming engines. And 230, 250 knots. And again, coming in, we'd come in low over the water. As far as where we would come in, it would depend upon where the government was surveilling at the time. We'd come in as far north as north of South Carolina, come across and shoot down the center of Florida. We'd come straight up the Gulf of Mexico. We'd come straight into Miami, off the coast of Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi with the oil drilling rig traffic coming in on a regular basis. The pattern there is an easy one to infiltrate with planes. Our borders are too big. There are too many places that it can be done. It can be done, and it can be done effectively.
You mentioned earlier about the aerostats being down more than they were up, and the fact that you had information when they were down.
The basic information was what was conveyed across the interdiction units, customs, DEA, from their base to their surveillance planes, to their interdiction planes.
So it was through radio transmissions that you were able to...
Correct. We had people on radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Since 1985, some things may have changed, but from your direct knowledge, is more of the transporting of the materials going through seagoing containers, or is it still mainly by airplane? And what areas now are being used that may not be used in the past?
In 1985, Rafael Cardona, in partnership with Pablo Escobar, bought several small cargo ships that were going to start using to ship cocaine in larger quantities. And basically, it was set or established to bring these ships up loaded with cement from Venezuela. But before they would put on the cement in Venezuela, the cocaine was loaded in Colombia.
Thank you.
They're going in more and more into large commercial traffic and owning their own, basically.
Thank you. My time is up.
Mrs. Patterson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Witness. I have sort of a twofold interest. Number one, I think as a parent of 3 teenagers, I'm extremely concerned about the use of drugs and the availability of drugs. And you, being a parent, it just, I wonder, and I don't want you to answer this question at this time, but I just wonder how you can justify your involvement to the extent that you did, and then emphasize how important education is to our people not to use it. But my main concern is, as we sit on this banking committee, the financial institutions, and is to judge how really banks are involved. And I want to ask you a couple of questions. Number one, I'd like to know a little bit more about your banks, as you called it, but that really aren't our banks. But explain to me, what is a bank?
A bank, as I referred to it, would just be a rented house with a couple living in it, that we would deposit our money in until the monies reach a level that Colombia decided was enough, or that they wanted the money now, and we would arrange for shipment down.
And they would just hold the money until you were ready for it?
Exactly.
Well, as far as banks, traditional banks, when you did use regular banks, did you...
I was only involved on the one occasion.
Okay. Well, then, to your knowledge, others, did they prefer large banks?
No, they
small
preferred
banks?
small banks where it was easier to control the people.